The presidential election of 1860 fractured the United States of America. There were 4 candidates running for office in 1860. The winning candidate was President Abraham Lincoln. He received 58% of the Electoral College vote. But you can see on the map that his winning coalition was across the northern part of the United States. That also happened to be the place that had the most population. Western Europeans, when they migrated or immigrated to the United States, found this part of the country much more comfortable and suiting to their environment. The rest of the country, as you proceed farther south, became less and less populated with Euro-Americans. In the north, Abraham Lincoln competed against Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas wanted to continue compromises like the Missouri Compromise. Stephen Douglas wanted the country to continue to expand slavery, but at a half and half pace. Half slave, half free. Bell was a constitutional unionist. Bell represents the yellow areas on this map. These are the counties that Bell won. Bell wanted to continue to expand slavery. He wanted to continue to protect slavery, but he thought the Union was more important than separation over slavery. That was the more popular opinion in the South. That was the opinion of Breckinridge. He was a Southern Democrat. As a Southern Democrat, he followed the principles of Andy Jackson, that this country was for European white Americans. And so he believed that if slavery could not be expanded into the territories of the West, the South should succeed from the Union. On the map, this looks like a very popular opinion. It actually looks more popular than Lincoln's, because this was a territorial map, not a people map. Abraham Lincoln's position garnered almost 40% of the popular vote. Breckinridge's position of slavery or secession only got 18% of the vote. This map is incredibly deceptive about the popularity of expanding slavery in the country. 40% of the country favored Lincoln's approach, which was a free soiler approach. Slavery should not be expanded. How do we know that? Well, we know it from his own words. We must not disturb slavery in the states where it exists, because the Constitution and the peace of the country both forbid us. We must not withhold an efficient fugitive slave law, because the Constitution demands it. As a constitutionalist, Abraham Lincoln favored enforcing current slave laws. He was not an abolitionist. But we must, by national policy, prevent the spread of slavery into new territories or free states, because the Constitution does not forbid us, and the general welfare does not demand such prevention. We must prevent the revival of the African slave trade, because the Constitution does not forbid us, and the general welfare does require the prevention. We must prevent these things being done by either Congress or the courts. The people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert it. So Abraham Lincoln ran for office that he was going to use the powers of the presidency to stop the spread of slavery. But as president, he would do nothing about slavery where it existed. He respected the 10th Amendment. This simply was not good enough for the southern states. South Carolina, in December of 20th, 1860, said that it had entered the United States as a free and independent state, therefore it could leave as a free and independent state. That neither the Constitution under the 10th Amendment, gave the exit of states to the federal government, nor prohibited the exit of states to the states. Therefore, each state could decide whether to leave the Union. As a compact among states, South Carolina freely entered the Union, and then South Carolina could freely dissolve the Union. Those were very broad principles about social contract theory. But then South Carolina continued about the specific grievances that caused it to lead or secede from the Union. First, Northern courts refused to return slaves. States like New Hampshire had free societies. When an escaped slave returned to New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire refused to use its state offices to return slaves. It was its state's right. The state of New Hampshire had a right not to return slaves. South Carolina wanted the federal government to return property to its rightful owners. They wanted the federal government to interfere in the domestic affairs, in the state affairs of New Hampshire, to return slaves. And so this upset South Carolina. South Carolina cited Northern hostility to slavery, that more and more Northern voters were either free soilers and supported Abraham Lincoln, or there were growing numbers of abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery altogether. And so Northern voters, according to South Carolina, elected a man whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Who was that? Abraham Lincoln. Notice the date here of this declaration. It's December 20th, 1860. The election was only 2 months earlier. Abraham Lincoln had not even entered office. He did nothing. South Carolina was upset because it lost a presidential election, and so it decided to leave the Union, stating that the guarantees of the Constitution will no longer exist. The equal rights of states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will become their enemy. Notice, the federal government was not their enemy. The federal government had taken no action in December of 1860. All of this was based on the fear of a central government. What might happen, what could happen if Abraham Lincoln broke his promises? Abraham Lincoln had no chance to even hold up his promises. South Carolina simply feared that as president, Lincoln would abuse his power and take away the right to slavery. Other slaveholding states followed suit. One of them was Mississippi. The senator from Mississippi was Jefferson Davis, who also went on to become the first president of the Confederate States of America. Davis, leaving the Senate, gave a speech explaining his decision to support Mississippi's exit from the Union. It has been the conviction of pressing necessity. It has been the belief that we are to be deprived in the Union of the right which our forefathers bequeathed to us, which has brought Mississippi into her present decision. She has heard proclaimed the theory that all men are created free and equal, and this made the basis of an attack upon her social institutions, and the sacred Declaration of Independence has been invoked to maintain the position of equality of the races. Now, what institution in Mississippi could equality of the races undermine? What in the world was Jefferson Davis talking about? Jefferson Davis was upset that there were growing numbers of people in America who believed that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. This language included African Americans as well as Euro Americans. If this were admitted, if one admitted that African Americans were equal and enjoyed equal rights, then the foundation of slavery would crumble. Jefferson Davis and the state of Mississippi had to leave the United States of America because they feared a growing equality of the races would undermine their peculiar institution of slavery. This was even made more clear by the future Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, when he was asked what would his new government look like. He said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great philosophical and moral truth." Alexander Stephens did not hide his racism. In fact, he was very proud of his racism, that racism would be the cornerstone of the Confederacy. The cornerstone is the key to building any physical structure. It's the stone that's laid first. If the cornerstone is off, if it's slightly off to one side or slightly off to another, then the building as a whole would be off. Alexander Stephens wanted the cornerstone of the Confederacy to be white supremacy. Off of that cornerstone, all of the other Confederate institutions would rise as an edifice to white supremacy. The authors of the Confederate Constitution started with the United States Constitution as a blueprint and then altered it. For example, "We the people of the Confederate States, each acting in its sovereign and independent character, in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America." So the Confederates took the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, and modified it. How did they modify it? Well, first they added state sovereignty. That the key to the Confederate Constitution is that it would no longer be a federal government, but it would be returning to the Confederate government. It would be in Articles of Confederation. They removed a comment about the common good, that their goal was not to promote the general welfare. Their goal instead was to support the independence of each and every individual state. Finally, they added a comment about invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. They believed that their white supremacy was founded on a biblical truth that white men were superior to black men. Because of that, they believed God would favor them and make their Constitution last longer than the United States of America. That the United States of America had turned their back on God because they favored equality of the races. The social contract of the United States Constitution then failed to prevent a split. The country split in two. Generally speaking, it's a North and a South. You can look at the map. The United States of America were in the north of the continent. The Confederate States of America were in the south of the continent, north versus south. But there's even something more striking, that the United States of America was a country made up of mixed states when it came to slavery. That in the United States of America, under President Lincoln, During the Civil War, the United States of America stayed a country that allowed for free states and slave states. Under the Confederate States of America, each and every state was a slave state. Slavery drove them to leave the United States of America. The Confederate States of America issued their new Constitution in February 1861. It left intact the basic structure of the federal Constitution. There was a separation of powers. There was even including a federal structure for a supremacy clause, that the laws made under the Constitution of the Confederate States of America would be the supreme law of the land. All of that looks really familiar. But the question is not what they left intact, but what did they change? They issued some very clear guidelines and clarifications. That Congress shall pass no law denying or impairing the right of the property in Negro slaves. Congress lost power. The Confederate States of America took the power of Congress away and gave it to the states. The states would have sovereignty over the right of property in Negro slaves. They changed the phrase 3/5 of a person when looking at congressional apportionment, changed that to make it clear that it referred to 3/5 of a slave. That each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to congressional reapportionment. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. That any person who legally bought a slave in the Confederate States of America could go anywhere in the country with their property and not fear a loss of property. That men of property were free to go wherever they wanted with their slaves, just as a person could travel any place in the country with a horse, or with their dog, or with their cattle. Slaves under the Confederate States of America were reduced to livestock. If that language weren't clear enough, the Confederate Constitution made it much clearer. The institution of Negro slavery, as it now exists in the Confederate States, shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate states and territories shall have the right to take to such territories any slave lawfully held by them in any of the states and territories of the Confederate States. Congress had no right or no sovereignty to regulate slavery. Each individual slave owner, each individual property owner had the right to maintain their property without the interference of a government. This was the purpose of the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution rewrote the American Constitution to protect the right of Euro-Americans to own slaves in their country. Regardless of what state they lived in, they could go anywhere and they would always enjoy the right to own slaves. Lincoln's election then in 1860 divided the country. Even before Abraham Lincoln took office, the southern states seceded from the Union. They left the United States of America because they were upset that they lost an election. The country, under the Constitution of the United States of America, elected a man, Abraham Lincoln, committed to stopping the spread of slavery. He admitted that he could do nothing about slavery in the South. That was a constitutionally protected right. The Southerners were not satisfied with having slaves in their states. They wanted the right to expand slavery. If they couldn't expand slavery, if they couldn't enjoy their slaves when traveling in other states, they found this tyrannical. And they decided to leave the United States of America in order to protect the right to own Negro slaves.